Hey, Josh Minthorn, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, John Espy. Great to see you again.
Great to see you here in the Launch Factory podcast studio in Charlotte, North Carolina.
Yeah, thank you.
So today we're going to talk about a topic that I know is near and dear to your heart as it is to mine, DevSecOps. But first, can you give just a real quick introduction to what Axcelinno is and what you guys are doing?
Absolutely. So we're a IT professional services consultancy, and we really focus on two areas, DevSecOps and Cloud. With both of those, what it's about for us is really helping customers and our clients really leverage technology to solve business challenges. Right? We see that there's an intersection of those two, and it's really important. Mm-hmm. And quite honestly, nowadays, what we see is just about every company is actually a technology company. For instance, banks. Yes, they do banking, but at the end of the day, we're not taking cash and depositing it in a bank that then sits in a vault, right? Everything is done electronically. And so with that growth of use of technology, and now we're moving faster and faster, and the way the economy is and everything is getting accelerated, our goal is to work with customers to understand those business challenges and then provide and help them come up with solutions using IT solutions, whether that's an out-of-the-box tool or something that's built, and enabling all those teams that are involved in that. And that's one of the things we'll talk about here today.
Great. No, thank you for the introduction, and hopefully we'll get to talk about some of your clients and some of the industries that you're working in. But as I mentioned before, we're going to really try to focus on DevSecOps. So let's start off with, how do you guys define DevSecOps?
That's a great question, because I think people have heard of DevSecOps, and people think, well, it's just DevOps with security. Yes and no. So the way that we look at DevSecOps is, with anything, as it started with the DevOps movement, is we're always shifting left. We're trying to get more things down into the SDLC, especially with development, because we're trying to move from being reactive to really being more proactive where we can. So what we want to do is we want to take application security, and we want to put those tools and those things that are used in that information into the developer's hands. But then also thinking about even down to the things like the infrastructure and stuff like that. So when we think about an application that runs, it's got to be on infrastructure, so that needs to be secure. When you're writing the code, the libraries, the things like that are being used, that needs to be secure. And then when something is running from an operational standpoint, how do you observe and understand when something is going on, and how do you then, and this is a key piece, address that quickly? Because you can always prevent as many things as possible, or try to, but the thing is, when something does happen, how do you get that fixed, or how do you address that issue as quickly as possible? Because it could impact business continuity, it could impact branding. I mean, there's so many things that it could impact. So really for us, to answer your question, John, is DevSecOps to us is bringing in more security into the SDLC, so that when we take code and it goes all the way out to production, we know that the environment the code is running in is secure, and the code itself is secure as well.
Yeah, so you're talking about two things that I'm picking up here. One is the operational side, the ops and DevSecOps, which is how do we respond in real time or closer to real time to new threats, to new opportunities, to whatever it may be. How do we observe that better? How do we do things in a more repeatable fashion? But also on the dev side of the house, it sounds like we're talking about improving efficiency and making it so that we can actually develop things faster. But through both of those lenses, we're making it more secure and baking it into the development tools and into the tools that are running in the operational environment.
That's spot on. That's 100% accurate.
Awesome. So you mentioned starting with DevOps. Can you maybe just real quickly talk about how Axcelinno maybe had some roots in DevOps and then kind of branched into DevSecOps and realized, because you're not even talking about DevOps as a first-class citizen anymore. You're talking about DevSecOps and Cloud. Those are your kind of the two things that you focus on. So how did you guys transition from a DevOps mindset to a DevSecOps mindset?
So what we noticed working with customers, and also when I was doing consulting myself, what I always noticed is you always tried to speed up development, and we still hit a bottleneck. And the bottleneck always was that before we were going to release, and this is after we've done development, we've gone through multiple iterations and phases of testing, right? The QA and the UAT and maybe some performance testing. Well, then it got to security. And what we saw was at that point in time, things were being found where it's like, well, this needs to go back and fixed. And we would see there was this, not necessarily contention, but it was between security and then between, let's say, like the business owner or the product owner and then the development teams saying, right, a little horse trading, right? They're trying to say, well, we've got to get this out here to meet a specific date, because if we don't meet this deployment window, we may not be able to deploy for another month or another quarter, especially in things like finance and insurance. And so there was always then a trade-off, which was, well, we'll fix these things, and then let's go ahead and get deployed. But then you still had this security and this technical debt that, quite honestly, we saw never got addressed. It would maybe come back up again, but it was, well, there's more important things. So these things just kept getting built. So at the end of the day, what we saw is, yes, you're speeding things up until you get to security. And then there's a trade-off, which is, hey, we're going out the door with known risks so that we can meet a date. And so at that point, we saw that, again, going for speed, but jeopardizing security. And it's like, well, that's not a way to do it. So we said, hey, you need to start to move security, further to the left and start to involve them sooner. Again, both at the infrastructure level and at the application layer level. And so there's a massive opportunity there that we saw, and really that's because there's a gap, and that's how we moved really from DevOps to DevSecOps. And you're right, DevOps was a first-class citizen, and now we say DevSecOps is a first-class citizen.
Well, and especially when you're deploying into a public cloud or even a hybrid cloud environment, there's a little less feeling of security because it's somebody else's infrastructure. That may or may not be well-founded, but there certainly is a perception with a lot of security teams that as we're deploying into a public cloud environment, that it's even more imperative that you properly secure that environment.
Yeah, absolutely. What we have seen is a lot of times, yes, going to the cloud, well, with any infrastructure, there's an inherent risk. And what we have seen that is a lot of the security concerns around going to the cloud is two things. One is it's about the unknown. And, well, how are we going to secure this? Because I think sometimes there's a thought around the public cloud is, okay, anybody can get access to it. But that's not the case. The other part of it, though, is what we've seen is maybe a lack of understanding or skills or proper planning. And this is also one of the things that we help customers with, is that when you go to the cloud, it is very different than, let's say, when you're on-prem and you're all on VMs and you really have your walled garden, right? When you go to the cloud, you can still build your walled garden, and it's easier, and it's also different. And so I think a lot of times what we see is those security concerns are, hey, we want to take what we've done on-prem and we just want to do it in the cloud. Oh, well, we can't do it that way in the cloud, so therefore it's not as secure. And for us, a lot of times it's, all right, let's walk through and work with you when it comes to your proper planning and your migration strategy. But then that also comes back into DevSecOps because there's an automation piece to that. There's infrastructure as code and configuration as code that is a key part of that, of making sure that you're secure when you go to the cloud. And to kind of think about that from a statistics and numbers standpoint, we all know that you take AWS and you take Azure and you take Google, and they're making hand over fist billions of dollars per quarter in revenue, and that's awesome. But it's the tip of the iceberg. So it's estimated that even though they make billions and billions of dollars of revenue every quarter, only about 5% of all available workloads are in the cloud.
Wow. We really are just scratching the surface here.
We are, and that's also why
it should be noted that there was an AWS outage yesterday.
Yes, I read about that, and I kind of laughed because of the services that it impacted. But that's a good point, though, because with the cloud and everything, and if you have automation and things like that, you can get up and running very quickly, again, without having to sacrifice security, so you're able to respond faster.
Absolutely. Well, I'd like to shift gears just a little bit here, and maybe if you could speak to some of the benefits that your clients are seeing by adopting DevSecOps. And if that ties in with public cloud, great. I realize we're a little more focused on DevSecOps here, but maybe just let the folks know kind of what your experience has been. Where are we adding value here? Is it top line? Is it bottom line? A little bit of both, that type of thing.
Yeah, I think the value is both. It's top line and bottom line. So give you, for instance, a number that's around dollars, and this came from NIST in terms of the impact of inadequate security testing. What they were able to do is they calculated what's the cost of finding a bug or a defect as you go through environments. And they found that overall, every year, companies are spending almost $60 billion a year because they weren't proactive, and security is kind of done at the end, like I mentioned before. And to put that into perspective, what they found is that a issue found in production is 5.5 to 6 times more expensive than when it was found in dev.
And this isn't a new concept in the world of business. The Japanese automakers figured this out, that, hey, if I can find it earlier in the process in the factory, I'm better off shutting off the entire factory to fix one defect early in the process. So this has been known for a long time in manufacturing processes, and it's interesting that we're just now figuring this out in many cases in the world of software.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned manufacturing. I always like to think of, and when we're talking with customers, say we get them into the mindset of, think of software as you are a software factory, right? You've got a floor and you're going through and you've got the idea and you're building and you're testing and you're iterating and you're going through and creating all of that. And just like you would with manufacturing, you're testing all of the parts. Because if a part is, doesn't have everything that it needs, if it's, got issues, and then that part gets used elsewhere, well, you've just moved those issues into the next thing that's gonna use it. And software nowadays is far more complex, especially as we start to break things down, and get into cloud native. That's obviously for a different discussion, but we're seeing those same things are coming about that we learn about. And it's almost like that light bulb moment, because it wasn't thought of that way. And when we working with customers and we see that light bulb moment, then it starts to click and they're like, okay, all right, let's start to do this. Or they've had that light bulb moment, but now they're saying, hey, can you work with us because we're having some challenges getting adoption for this. We're getting resistance to change here, or what do we need to do here? Or, hey, we have all of these tools, but yet we're still running into the same issues.
So it sounds like one of the things you're hitting on here is that your clients, by adopting these DevSecOps tools and mindsets and culture, is improved software. It just works better, meaning more secure, meaning it does what it's supposed to do correctly. And it's especially important because of all the reusable components and services that are out there, because if you get one thing wrong and it gets into production and it's used by 20 systems, you've just amplified that defect tremendously. So that's one benefit. I'm going to guess also that on the developer side, develop software faster so that they can write more code and build more applications. Is that pretty accurate? Yeah,
it's kind of twofold there. So, we get an application or a service out the door. That's usually not the end of it. There's bug fixes, or eventually you're going to add more features and things like that. So, developers are really starting to be under more and more pressure, at an accelerated rate to get things out the door. And if developers are doing that, they're under pressure for that, and then they're going through the process, and again, they get held up with security. They get frustrated because they're saying, hey, we've got to get this out the door. I can't sit around and wait because I got to move on to the next thing. And so if through DevSecOps, you really start to enable those developers up front, make them aware of security issues and things that they've done, in whether it's in the code or whether they're using specific libraries that have vulnerabilities, things like that, they can address it really up front as they're developing the code. And therefore, you start to move through things faster. I like to think of it as the late Colin Powell said, slow is smooth and smooth is fast, right? So if developers are doing things sooner, it's a much smoother development process, and things are getting out the door faster at an accelerated rate, obviously, again, without having to sacrifice anything around security.
That's awesome. I found DevOps religion on one of our early clients when you and I were working together at Level. We had a large bank who wanted to adopt some CI/CD tools and some code automation tools as well. And it was really interesting to me to see this giant bank who would build products very slowly, but they wanted to make products faster. And one of the real answers for how to do it was to upgrade their infrastructure. And we would see that what used to be a 6-week deployment process drops down to a matter of hours, and they get all of the compliance that they would have had before. And I think that's when I really started to find that DevOps religion, as I like to call it. Did you guys have a similar moment with DevSecOps, or can you maybe speak to some concrete, maybe not necessarily a specific client, but just some examples where it was like a real aha moment, like, wow, they're really driving value with this?
Yeah, so, I remember the client you're talking about, and then at Axcelinno, we've had those as well, right, where we start to automate, and the customer can now roll out in a brand new environment, completely secure, in what used to take 4 to 6 weeks, now only takes a couple of hours. We've definitely seen that. A lot of times with that aha moment is when, especially because you start to get infrastructure and then security involved, where when you're doing the automation piece, because they're used to, all right, the developers are writing code, that's great and everything, but what about the infrastructure? So a lot of times we see that aha moment when you are automating the provisioning and the configuration of things that are going to get deployed, and just purely at that infrastructure layer, and having security on that. And a lot of times what we see is, what we start to talk about, especially with automation, is the more you start to automate at the infrastructure level, the more secure you become, because you actually are going to start to restrict access. And a lot of times I get this kind of look, or they're kind of scratching their heads, and I say, here's why. By restricting access, less people are on a server making changes that may or may not be documented. And people go in and make changes, and 3 different people may go in to try to make the same change, but they do it differently. Or they tested a change and they didn't back it out, whatever it may be. And when you automate it now, less access, and it's always done consistently. And what that comes into, especially from a security standpoint, especially compliance, as you mentioned, is that if it's always done the same way, it may be done a certain way and you're out of compliance. Well, if you fix the automation, now you just roll it out everywhere and now you're compliant. And then they start to because then you start to hear stories of, oh yeah, we get this thing where we're out of compliance and an audit's coming up and it's really stressful because we got to drop what we're doing and all these projects and now we got to go fix it, but we're not quite sure where we've fixed it or where we haven't fixed it. And they also don't know what they don't know, because they don't know every server that's been touched by someone, because it's usually not been tracked.
Yep. No, it's really mind-boggling how much improvement you can get from automating as much of your infrastructure, your code, and all of your practices. And the computer isn't going to make mistakes in those deployments. Once you tell it the right thing to do, it's going to do it the right way every single time. And patch management is again, I may have patched this server, but I forgot about the 13 other servers that needed that exact same SSL patch or SSO library patch. If I've got it in one central location where it's being done in a very, very repeatable manner, then the compliance folks are going to be a lot happier, has been my experience. So that's great. So there's obviously a lot of benefits that your clients are seeing from DevSecOps. Let's talk a little bit about, and you've hinted at some of the tools, but what are the types of tools? I've heard you say observability. We've obviously talked about public cloud. I think we've mentioned CI/CD. What are some of the tools that, not necessarily specific products, but the types of things that people are adopting in order to really drive what you consider a DevSecOps culture? Yeah,
to preempt that, I always like to think of no one tool is a silver bullet. If anybody's telling you that it does everything, you should run the other way, because when someone says it can do everything, that means it probably does a lot of things and it just does them okay. And so on the flip side of that too is what we've seen a lot with customers is they have all sorts of tools. Lots of time they're duplicative and things like that. And they're like, oh, well, we have all these tools, we're good. And it's like, well, hold on one second. You got to be using the tools the right way. And also, don't have duplicative tools, because that means you have different skill sets and knowledges. And at some point, tools don't get used because people are just trying to move faster because they're under all sorts of different pressures to deliver. So a couple of things that we see is one, obviously source code repository. I think that's name of the game, especially for source code. But when you get into infrastructure as code, configuration as code, that's also where you can use source control because now you control access. You're centralizing your definitions of everything, and you're controlling, again, who has access to that. And you can easily see that if, say, a vulnerability is found or what have you, it's very easy to go find where that is, write it once, run the automation that uses that everywhere it needs to go, and you're done. And you start to get a history there. So that's really, really important. And then the other part too is we're starting to see more and more tools that do CI, right? Continuous integration, and CD, the continuous delivery piece. We used to just kind of see CI. It's important to either have something that does both or tools that do both of those things, right? You don't want to automate CI and not automate CD or vice versa. So having those tools are really, really important. And then with that too is the scanning, right? And there's scanning at different levels. There's scanning at the source code and what somebody's writing, but also, let's say, the library, especially if you're dealing with open source, scanning the libraries that developers have decided to use to understand, one, what's being used. And it might be okay right now, but in the future, something might be found, or somebody might use a new version and there's a vulnerability, but you don't know. So it's making sure that you have that. And what we've also started to see is, especially around containers and orchestration and stuff there, making sure that you have scanning at that level as well. So anything you're doing to, again, the code and how you're running it, make sure you have the ability to scan and do things. And then the other part of that too is especially around sensitive information. So usernames, passwords to get to databases and all sorts of things there. Make sure that that's not just wide open in text files and things like that. Have that be secured.
And I'd like to interrupt you there for just a second, because this has been an observation that I've had. A big part of adopting this mindset is test automation, and that in my experience enables the CI and enables the CD. But you've got to be able to automate the test. And what you start to see is test data sets that have sensitive information in them. So is that the type of scanning that you're talking about? Hey, do I have personally identifiable information in the form of account numbers or social security numbers or ID numbers? Is that it, or is there even more to that?
That's absolutely it. So there, automated testing and everything is really important, and that grows over time. But then you're spot on. The data that you're using when you're doing testing is really important. One, to make sure you're not testing with junk data that gives you, saying, oh, this works. But when you go out to an environment with actual real data, then it fails. You're like, well, I don't understand, right? You want to avoid that. But yet the same thing there is, one, are you using appropriate test data that, isn't just a pull from, let's say, production and it's real people's information. Mm-hmm. But then also, there's scanning around all of that to say, okay, you're working with personal identifiable information. Do you have the controls in place to make sure that the code isn't exposing that, right? So there's also that sort of testing as well, which I think a lot of times gets forgotten about, because a lot of times when we think of testing, it says, okay, I give it 1 + 1, I should expect 2. Well, should it, is it exposing that you gave it 1 and 1, right? So there's multiple layers of testing there when it comes to that test automation piece.
Absolutely. So are there, in your experience, are there different industries that adopt DevSecOps and it means different things to them? Or is it kind of I'm guessing it's not a one-size-fits-all, but do you see some trends from an industry perspective? And are maybe certain industries a little bit ahead of the game or a little bit behind the game?
So you're right. It's not one size fits all, but there are some foundational things that, regardless of the industry, should be in place. Right?
You mentioned source control.
Right.
That's step one. Right?
Exactly. You got to start there. You shouldn't be storing it on someone's laptop. Things like that. So there's some foundational things. What we have seen from an industry's perspective is we're talking about, if you've got, let's say, HIPAA or PCI or identifiable information, there's additional things that you have to do from regulations and compliance. Insurance, banking, there's a lot of industries that have to adhere to that. So that's absolutely extra things that those industries need to deal with. What I've seen predominantly is that those industries too are really, really focused on security, right? That is at the forefront of their mind, because if there's a data breach, it's a big, big problem. And again, what we've seen is what they kind of struggle with is it's at the end. And again, it's so important that the bottleneck is even larger because there's such a huge focus on security. And that's even why it's so important that you say, look, remove this bottleneck, and you gotta get all that security stuff further to the left. Other industries, yes, there's security. They just may not be as complex or in depth because they just don't have some of the compliance.
And it may not be as obvious. A bank inherently has to worry about protecting credit card data, right?
Yes.
They've had to do that from the very first days of opening the Visa network. It may not be as obvious to a retailer that they're storing sensitive information, whether it be inside of their pharmacy and they've got some HIPAA-related issues. That's probably a bad example. I think most pharmacies are going to understand HIPAA, but they may not understand the complexities of storing card on file type of data where they've actually got credit card data. And I think that's where a lot of interesting opportunities rise, because again, I think the banks are a little bit further ahead or further in front of this because it's so core to what they do as businesses. But a lot of other businesses who maybe haven't had to think about these things, especially brick and mortar retailers who are building new e-commerce capabilities and all sorts of new integrations, may not have had to think about these things before.
Yeah, and what we see too, going back to, go into the cloud, it's not secure. What we see a lot of times is that what somebody has done traditional on-prem is secure because it's on-prem, and it's that walled garden. And yes, if you go to the cloud, it would expose what's being done, because at the end of the day, what they're doing is actually not secure. It's just
obscure.
It feels secure because, again, they're in a walled garden and it's controlled. And so moving to the cloud or different architecture, things like that, exposes that sort of thing. And that's a key part too, that when we're working with customers around DevSecOps, we're working to identify where they may not be aware that there's a security issue, right? I'll give you an example. For instance, customer might say, oh, well, only a certain group of people are allowed to access these servers. Well, that's a security issue because somebody can access the servers. Or they'll say, well, it's just this group, and we'll say, well, how do you do user provisioning and deprovisioning, for instance, when they're hired? Oh, well, we manually go in and do this. And we're like, well, that's a security concern there. That's a vulnerability, because purely just within your process, let's find a way to do secure identity and secrets management. Let's look to do this in an automated way so that it's really fewer hands on keyboard, because fewer hands on keyboard, again, tends to lead to reduced security vulnerabilities and attack vectors, because you've shrunken the attack surface.
That's great. So it sounds like for you guys, it's the finance and the healthcare spaces that are kind of the leaders in the space. Are there any that you would call laggards? Maybe not to pick on any industry.
Yeah, there are those that are laggards. We see that especially around manufacturing, and a lot of times around supply chain. And I'm not necessarily referring to FedEx and UPS. They're great at what they do because they've been doing it for a long time. But when we talk with customers that, let's say, for instance, are still on mainframes or some older technology, they're definitely the laggards, and those tend to be in those industries that have been around for a long time, and that's that manufacturing and some of that supply chain and logistics. Again, those are the ones that we tend to see this. I'll give you an example. We were talking to a customer, and they are using mainframe, and they've got Windows, and they've got a plugin from IBM and everything. They're on Windows 2000. Well, that went out of support, I think, in 2012. And so it's okay, working through this with them, and then we keep talking to them, and it's again one of those things where, well, this vulnerability, and there's this and this and this, and honestly, what we see there is those industries tend to continue to think of IT as a budget line item as opposed to an investment that leads to potentially revenue growth, or if you invest in it, can have a major impact on that top line revenue or the end user experience, right? So what is it like to interact, or can you provide, let's say, order tracking functionality without having to be manually involved, or do you have to be down and have an outage, during the weekend when no orders can be placed because you've got to do an update? That all has an impact to end users, whether they're external end users and customers, or whether those end users are internal.
Who are some of the leading vendors in this space from your perspective? What are the vendors that you're constantly seeing in a lot of different organizations across industries?
That's a good question, because it depends on who we're talking to. I would say more of what we're seeing is things around, there's GitLab, because they have security scanning and they've got built-in CI/CD. We're seeing more and more with now with GitHub, because they've got GitHub Actions.
They're owned by Microsoft, correct? GitHub.
Yes, Microsoft bought them, and then Microsoft has Azure DevOps, which a little bit of duplicative functionality, but still being able to have that automated CI/CD process and being able to plug in other tools and platforms that provide security. What we've seen a lot of growth is, for instance, from Sonatype. A lot of times we think of that as just Nexus, but they've built out their portfolio where they can do scanning in a lot of different layers, down at the code layer, down at actually the infrastructure layer. Red Hat, they've got OAuth scanning and things like that built in. And they purchased and they acquired StackRox like 18 months ago, something, and that does scanning. And then you hear about Aquasec. So there's just a lot of players, and I think we're going to see that continued growth, because again, there's going to be that move in the industry of what we're seeing, which is you move from DevOps being a first-class citizen to DevSecOps being the first-class citizen.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. What about Atlassian? They were a player when I was dabbling a little bit more deeply in this. I'm assuming that they're still around and offering products in this space. Is that someone you run into a lot? Or?
We run into them, but they've really stayed with Confluence and with Jira and things like that. They've really kept that to be their bread and butter. We haven't run into Atlassian really for more than that. Okay. In fact, what we have seen is customers moving away from like Bamboo, and I can't remember off the top of my head what Atlassian source control is, and a lot of times they're moving away from that because they want to move into something that has more features and flexibility and starts to include more of that sort of security and the scanning and things that go with it.
So you've mentioned here a couple of I don't want to call them legacy vendors, but vendors who have been around a long time. Mm-hmm. Red Hat has been around for a while, but more importantly, they're owned by IBM now. So You're really talking about IBM here. You've mentioned Microsoft a couple times. Obviously, two leading players in this space. We've also talked about, though, Amazon and Google, who maybe aren't your traditional enterprise technology vendors. Can you speak a little bit to your experience working with those vendors, because again, Google is an advertising company
at the end of the day,
yeah. They're really not a technology company. Amazon, I mean, they are a technology company, but their business is advertising, right? With Amazon, obviously, this is a retailer who has great technology. But is there, in your experience, do you guys find it different working with an Amazon and a Google versus an IBM/Red Hat or a Microsoft?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So when you think of AWS, you think of Google, and you think of Azure from the Microsoft standpoint, that's the cloud. It's about consumption of services and really lowering the barrier to entry to get a customer to start to run workloads in the cloud, right? So that's what they're focused on. They're going to provide a lot of different services to really make it easy to migrate and run. We talk about refactoring and rehosting and all that good stuff. But that's, to some degree, that's almost where they stop. They might include some things around security scanning, but it's only to a point. There's gaps.
I've seen the same thing with observability. They all have their observability tools, but you still probably are layering on a Datadog or some other more purpose-built.
Right, absolutely. Because again, it's when you look at all those cloud providers, they, for instance, observability, they go to a point to say, all right, your applications are running, and here's how you can monitor. But it's just honestly, it's to keep the workload running. Mm-hmm. It's not necessarily about how secure is your workload? And those gaps is where, again, that the Sonatype and Red Hat with, StackRox and GitLab with their built-in security scanning, those players are starting to fill some of those holes because it's not in those specific cloud providers. And then the other thing too is that you have to be in that cloud provider. And the other thing too is that what happens when you're across multiple cloud providers? Do you want to have to do it 1, 2, or 3 different ways? You can choose tools that aren't necessarily native and specific to any of those cloud providers, and that way it's really done in that consistent manner.
And I think you're bringing up a really good point there. In an ideal world, maybe you only have one cloud provider. Maybe you don't. But let's just assume that was where your ideal state. You've made a decision as an IT organization. We're a GCP shop, or we are AWS, and we're all in, or we're Azure.
Yep.
The reality is that there's a lot of M&A activity in most industries and a lot of consolidation. And you might not be able to just lift and shift out of one of those environments into another one to conform to your standard. And that's not even talking about, there is a question of, should we put all of our eggs in one basket? These are 3 very, very powerful companies. They're going to ostensibly be around for a long time, but do you really want to be in bed exclusively with one of those? So I think a multi-cloud environment does speak to the need for tools that aren't necessarily as specific.
Absolutely, and also too, that highlights the importance of DevSecOps, because if you're in multiple clouds, you want to be able to do things consistently. You want to be able to still continue to automate. At the end of the day, as the joke goes, it's somebody else's computer. So if you're in Azure and AWS and GCP or one of them, or even in IBM Cloud, you need to make sure that wherever you are, things are secure in terms of access, right? In that you're still provisioning, you're still configuring things in an automated way. Because at the end of the day, when you're in those clouds, they're compute resources that are hosting applications and services. So it's even more important, I think, at that point to really actually have DevSecOps, because it can get very quickly. We have seen with customers that do that where they don't have a great strategy, costs go through the roof, they have security issues, and again, it's because they're just really being very reactive and they're running around trying to just put out different fires because there's some of the things that they didn't do up front, and that's okay, right? Time is a resource, you can only do but so many things, and that's where we come in and say, hey, let's take a step back, let's look across all of this, and let's put together a comprehensive and a holistic strategy to really help you avoid all these fires to begin with, because at the end of the day, this is not what provides value, right? Putting out fires is not what provides value to your end users and your customers. Let's have these folks working on, that gray matter, that value add activities. And so let's again remove kind of all this cruft and these distractions, and now have people start to really work on things that adds value.
Yeah, I heard. I have a former client from a prior life who, she worded it really nicely. She created a dashboard that she called the win. What's important now? And her thing was, I want my people working on not just what's urgent, but more importantly, what's important, because too often the urgent, the fire that needs to be put out, gets pushed ahead of something that's actually important and could actually be a game changer for your business.
Right. Yeah. Right. And that comes from probably maybe like Stephen Covey, right? Where it's, what's important, what's urgent. And when you're working on something that's urgent but not important, it's reactive. You want to get more to that proactive stage of things, which is what's important but not urgent, which means you're ahead of the game and you're planning. That's why that automation is important. And that dashboard, quite honestly, is really about observability, right? And it's understanding and having a catalog of everything that's going on and insight into things, so that what are we working on that's important, and what are some of the things that maybe can take a back seat, right? It's okay to have technical debt. It's just that technical debt that you've accumulated shouldn't be something that puts you at risk, or again, is that trade-off of, like we were talking about before, of, well, I've got to get out the door and meet this date, so can we not do some of these security things right now?
Yep, absolutely. Well, this has been great. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you think we ought to talk about in this realm? I know you could talk for days, but we do have a schedule we're adhering to. But is there anything that we've missed that you wanted to make sure we covered today?
No, I think we've really hit the nail on the head on again, moving DevSecOps into being a first-class citizen, and why that's so important. And one term we didn't talk about, which is cycle time. And that's really one of the things that we've been talking about here is reducing that cycle time, which is how do you get code from that idea, right? Go from that idea out to production and to end users and making sure that you're doing that securely. And at the end of the day, DevSecOps is about reducing that cycle time, but also doing it securely. So we're not doing that trade-off. And that's really the key thing for us is what DevSecOps means is reduce that cycle time, but being secure in its own right.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Josh. This has been very informative.
Absolutely, John. Thank you for having me.